Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for Boosters and Barkers, in which David Roberts will delve into the fascinating world of financing Canada's participation in the First World War. I'm Tabitha Fritz. I'm on the board of the Canadian Business History Association, and I am the chair of the Development Committee. I'm joined today by two guests. One of them is Joe Martin, with whom many of you are familiar. He's the co-author of From Wall Street to Bay Street and the president of the Canadian Business History Association. He's a former partner in charge of the Canadian management consulting practice in what is now Deloitte Consulting. And he spent 25 years at the Rotman School, where he introduced our course in Canadian business history, which is where I met Joe. We are also joined today by author David Roberts. Now, if you saw our announcement of this talk in our newsletter, you would have seen that his biography included being a renowned climber, mountaineer, and author known for his impactful contributions to mountaineering literature, having authored numerous books and articles on climbing and outdoor adventure. However, that biography came from his Amazon page, or Amazon.com's book page for his book, and is quite incorrect. And in fact, he is a retired editor of the Dictionary of Canadian Biography. In addition to writing many entries for the DCB, he's also the author of In the Shadow of Detroit, Gordon M. McGregor, Fort of Canada, and Motoropolis. He lives in the mountainous heights of Don Mills, Ontario. Thank you for joining us today. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm having a lot of fun with my new mountaineering identity, so I won't repeat that during this talk, but amongst friends and family, it's got great mileage. So I'll say that. I would also first like to thank the Canadian Business History Association for hosting this talk about boosters and barkers, financing Canada's involvement in the First World War. Published, I'm happy to say, by the University of British Columbia Press in association with the Canadian War Museum. So let's set the scene here. Canada's participation in the First World War came at horrendous human cost, nearly 61,000 killed and another 172,000 injured, a sacrifice that has become fixed in our literature and collective memory. We're well aware of that. But there was another cost, a financial one, which has received much less attention. Economists at the time of the war and in advance of the Second World War looked at this. More recently, some historians, among them the late Christopher Kobrak and today's other participant, Joe Martin, touch on wartime finance and its implications. My goal in the book and today is to expand our view of finance in an interdisciplinary manner, building on an in-depth examination of government accounts and actions, which are the bedrock of boosters and barkers. And I will explain this title in a minute. Neither conventional military nor economic history, Boosters progresses through 5 parts, and let me tell you about them. Part 1, which is heavily empirical, enhanced by tables and appendices, details the fundamental task of getting the money to fund the ever-escalating costs of a never-ending war and operations at home, including a beleaguered railway system, navigating the shoals of conscription and highly divisive politics, and adjusting to post-war realities. Before the war, Canada drew upon conventional sources of revenue, mainly customs and excise duties. From the start, Finance Minister Thomas White had a very simple mandate. Get the money. Get the money, Thomas White. As cost escalated and war dragged on, new approaches had to be found. Like most belligerents, Canada resorted to borrowing from Britain early in the war, from banks, and most notably from the public through 6 war loans, where, during defined campaigns, Canadians were asked to subscribe to buy bonds with fixed maturities and rates of return. To many, the concept was foreign. What developed in terms of business history was a continuum of federal allocations and national loans, with bridging from temporary loans, debenture stock, treasury bills, and saving stamps and certificates, all very bewildering to the average reader. Even with annual budgets, White seldom had finance in place for more than 4 months ahead. The Dominion War Loan of November 1915, the first, created a template for bond rates and terms. That same year, Canada and Britain entered into an unconventional reciprocal funding arrangement, whereby, in simple terms, Britain paid our forces overseas in exchange for Canada's funding of munitions and food production here. When Britain's needs built to crisis proportions in 1917, Canada set the wheels in motion for its first victory loan, an extraordinary hard sell characterized by all manner of publicity, the sometimes tense coordination of the press, vital bank loans, marketing experts bent on selling bonds just as they would sell pickles and food, the influence of pandemic and coercion to boost investment in bonds, and seeking to sell Canadians on a very remote war. Throughout, one sees Thomas White's determination to retain control of the financial levers. From another business perspective, I follow the development of the securities field as war bonds flooded the marketplace to the point where the government implemented stabilizing control. I am also conscious of how companies and corporations, when called upon to subscribe, responded with enthusiasm while prudently managing their assets. Part 2 traces the war loan campaigns across the country, urban and rural, orchestrated by a national publicity machine with a compendium of solicitations from door-to-door canvassing to mass distributions of pamphlets, measured not in numbers, but in tons and languages. I strive to see local developments as part of a national picture, including French-speaking Quebec and Newfoundland. The Dominion war loans of 1915, 1916, and early 1917 set financial agendas while publicly answering such simple question as, what is a bond? The newly named victory loans of 1917, 18, and 19 were focused on orchestrated campaigns of a few weeks' durations, shaped by the tight financial cycles facing the government, as well as market factors. Many campaigns were street carnivals, prompting one veteran soldier to bemoan the, quote, boosters, barkers, and spielers, hence my title. Women and children were prime targets. The ideologies of Christianity and thrift, to save money to buy bonds, and the inducements of entertainment loomed large. The biggest achievements of the publicity machine may well have been the education of Canadians about investment in war bonds and their seismic landing in society, where they became lodged in the public's imagination. At this point, we're going to put an image up on the screen. That is the Victory Loan Parade in Hamilton, 9 November 1918, just before the armistice. This image comes to us courtesy of David Bartlett in Calgary. Now, you look closely at the screen. This is no orchestrated military band. You see kids on the right. You see some kind of circus wagon also on the right. And you look at the band, the parade itself, it's a real ragtag, collection of musicians, some playing drums, some playing what look to me like bedpans. So this is very, very vibrant, very raucous. And one might well ask, what's the connection here with finance? I explore that question in Boosters and Barkers. We can take the image down now. Part 3, which I call Newfoundland and the Canadian Collection, moves readers to the Rock, then a separate dominion. With a much smaller population, Newfoundland had one public war loan in 1918, which was centered in St. John's. Government finance is tracked, but a comprehensive account of the loan campaign there is confounded by underreported in the island's few newspapers, particularly on the results from small towns and outports. Clear, however, is Newfoundland's use of loan expertise and financing from Canadian, British, and American sources. Part 4 probes consensus and its flip side, resistance. Despite the nationwide nature of the campaigns, not every Canadian understood the concept of bonds or bought into an imagined Canadian commonality. Where investment value was paramount, subscription did not necessarily mean support for the war. Shades of patriotism are exposed. There was inability to subscribe for bonds because of limited means and ill health, cynicism, political and conscientious aversion, and opposition to spiraling national debt. Ethnic, religious, and labor sectors reacted. In Quebec, which I examined closely, newspaperman Henri Bourassa, an ardent opponent of an imperial war and a victory loan skeptic, came to endorse bonds within days of the armistice as a nationalist obligation to reconstruction. Everywhere coercion can be seen. I give a number of instances, one which I want to tell you about involving a fatal shooting. And I'm reading now, from what I wrote in the book. On November the 11th, 1918, with anti-German sentiment rampant, a boisterous group celebrating the armistice in Drumheller, Alberta, turned into a mob. They had been driving around in high spirits and had gone to a cafe to sign bond papers and kiss the Union Jack. They then decided to terrorize German-born residents said to have refused to support the Victory Loan and the Red Cross. After taking two of them to a pool room and compelling them to buy bonds and apologize for their origins, the gang, not all of them official bond salesmen, dashed off into the countryside. After forcing subscriptions from an elderly farmer and his son, the pack, led by one Edward Blaine, a barber, arrived at the farmhouse of Albert Arnold, a single 35-year-old native of Germany and reportedly an army officer there. He had come to Canada and was naturalized in 1914, although to the Drumheller Mail newspaper, he was, quote, a Hun. According to a neighbor, one of the gang shouted in reply to Arnold's call to what they wanted. "We've got you now, you son of a bitch." After stoning the house and then knocking but receiving no answer, they entered. When Blaine, who was wrapped in Union Jack, approached an inner door, he was shot by a terrified Arnold. The rest of the party fled, but would later return for Blaine's body, at which point Arnold bolted. He gave himself up the next morning. At his trial for murder in January, it was heard that he had acted in self-defense and was acquitted. So that's just one instance. There were many, many others of coercion and cooperation, and I try to give more examples, mainly for interest's sake, in the book. So after part 4, I move on to part 5, which is the final part. It deconstructs war loan propaganda into complementary components: the visual imagery, the parades and music, the noise propaganda, quote, as one Nova Scotia newspaper put it, and literature. Now you can see my tie-in to that photograph that we put up earlier. Literature that was both official and unofficial. With varying degrees of effectiveness, these means, which the public could seldom avoid, but could filter, created the educational atmosphere marketeers believed was vital to sell war bonds and the need for support. The word atmosphere was used repeatedly. This is where propaganda can be seen as the business of marketing, creating the climate needed to stimulate subscriptions and sustain interest year-round, just as Canadians were being bombarded with calls to donate their nickels and dimes to a plethora of causes, not to mention recruitment appeals. Along with carefully selected illustrations, which were a lot of fun to do, I examined posters and cartoons in this context. The sounds of the war loans are much harder to convey. Here is one attempt drawn from a published score that exhorted Canadians to rush to their pianos. So get set to listen. You probably got a sense of the music there, and the propaganda, the exhortive messaging that was going on in there. That little ditty didn't get anywhere, but the author, the composer, exhorted people to go to their pianos, and most homes had a piano. So whether people played it or not, but there were many other forms of music in theaters, community halls, and so on. They all tie in, and this is part of the atmosphere. As was the case with a number of publicity initiatives, I found no evidence, as I say, that the chorus caught on, but there was sound. In assembly halls, along parade routes, we saw that in the photograph, all of which quickly dissipated after the war. Sanctioned articles and essays also expanded the atmosphere, as did official letters. From Saskatchewan in February 1919, an 11-year-old wrote to the children's section of a Winnipeg newspaper that he had grown wheat on a patch on the family farm. Plus, he wrote, "I was in the boys and girls pig contest this summer, and I got 7th prize. The prize was $4. I bought a $50 victory bond with my money. I have a brother that enlisted in 1916. He was killed in action on October 30th. He was 25 years old. Signed, Kenneth Lyon." I was stunned by this young boy's consciousness in one simple letter of a victory bond and his brother's death. How people responded adds immeasurably to our grasp of finance. Indeed, human voices are repeatedly drawn into boosters where ideology, investment, and everyday life are interwoven. By the time of the armistice in 1918, and into months of demobilization, when 1919 emerged as Canada's most expensive, quote, war year, that was the government's term, but with fading enthusiasms, it got the money it needed. As can be seen in my exhaustive, some might say exhausting, look at Canada's wartime finance, the war loans produced nearly a third of the country's war cost, which was estimated at $6.6 billion. In 1940, during the Second World War, one journalist called the loans, quote, the greatest mass selling performances ever achieved in Canada. The achievement was not attained without long-term financial consequences, which I follow. New levels of national debt, war taxes that became permanent, a reshaped securities market, the repayment of war loans as they became due, and their refinancing into the 1940s. So that's boosters and barkers. I hope this talk gives you some idea of the potential in seeing war finance, not just statistically, but through a wide lens. I myself see directions for much more investigation. Before I address any questions, I believe Joe Martin has a few remarks and maybe questions of his own. Joe?
Thank you very much, David. David and I only met in January, and I would like to thank David Wilson for bringing the two of us together. I was, of course, always pleased to meet anybody who had the highly prestigious role of general editor of the Dictionary of Canadian Biography, one of the great contributions we have in this country. But I was stunned to learn that he'd written a book about World War I financing. And I was stunned because this sort of isn't done in Canada. We have excellent World War I scholars, but we don't talk about the financing of the war. So I did two things, or two things happened. I invited him to appear on CBH Talks, and he was kind enough to give me a copy of his book, which I've enjoyed reading, and I will have one or two questions when I'm finished to ask David about the book. And by the way, I should have known this, but I didn't know it. He's also written a book about McGregor of Ford Canada. And I'm reading that now, and I am enjoying that very much. Thank you, David. My own interest in the war, I guess, began as a child and evolved over time. From youthful images of World Wars I and II, to reading military scholars and writing about the Icelandic Canadian contribution, to the financial aspects when the late Chris Kobrak and I wrote From Wall Street to Bay Street, which is an analysis of two developing nations, and we use that term very deliberately, developing nations, because we go back to the 18th century and trace the evolution of the United States and Canada, and obviously World War I has a huge impact on our finances. In terms of developing nations, you might be interested to know that the book has been translated into Mandarin, and I've gotten my first sales report from China, and to my astonishment, we sold 5,250 copies there last year, compared to 1,250 copies in North America so far. So that was very intriguing. I guess they are interested in how our two financial systems have developed. So my focus will very much be on financing of the war after a brief intro of previous interests, and I won't be dealing with the loan campaigns, nor Newfoundland and Labrador, nor consensus versus resistance, nor war loans propaganda, because David has covered all of that. Let me begin with a youthful perspective of war. And my perspective was of World War II as a child, not World War I. And even though I grew up in a tiny village in Saskatchewan, we did get a pretty full picture thanks to CBC radio and to the daily papers from Regina and Saskatoon, the Leader Post and the Star Phoenix, which came in daily by train. World War II took on special meaning for me at the time of the Battle of the Bulge. I was just about to turn 8 years old, and an uncle of mine had gone to the United States, volunteered, and was fighting with a reconnaissance unit, and he was captured. And that certainly increased our interest in that great struggle. But even before, and in our home, in our village, and in my mother's family farm 200 miles east, there were the pictures of those who had gone before. My mother's family came to Canada from Iceland in 1890. Within a month of arriving in what was then the Northwest Territories, now the province of Saskatchewan, my first uncle was born, and his name was Johan Enerson. He went to fight in the World War I, as did two of his brothers, and I had one English uncle in the fight as well. And when my uncle Johan, or Uncle John, depending on how you want to say it, went to England, on his ship was a gentleman by the name of John Diefenbaker. And when I first met John Diefenbaker many, many years ago, I asked him about an uncle of mine who was delivered his mail. He immediately remembered my uncle who he traveled with. And there you can see here, you can tell Diefenbaker's eyes. And when I did further research on this, Uncle John was killed, in the words of Siegfried Sassoon, "I died in hell, it was Passchendaele." I wrote one article on this topic, and lo and behold, in a shoebox at our house, I found more candid photos like this taken in England before, where the training before they went overseas. I also had an English uncle who fought on land and in the air, and he had been killed. He died in hospital in Dublin in less than 12 hours after being admitted from the flu epidemic. Somewhat ironic that he had survived battle on land and in the air. So that was a personal background that I had. And when I was going through university, like many people of my age, I served in COTC and had the great good fortune to be with the 2nd Battalion, Princess Patricia's, the first Canadian unit ever to win a presidential citation for their work in Korea. I have a pretty good collection of World War I books at my cottage, and of course, I knew some of the authors, Desmond Morton and Jack Granatstein. And I have to confess that when Tim Cook came upon the scene, I thought, why do we need anyone else? These guys have covered the waterfront. But of course, Tim added a whole new dimension, although none of them really touched upon financing. And I think as Canadians, we can all be proud of the magnificent Canadian War Museum in Ottawa, but I haven't been there for a few years, and I don't recall a section or even a display on the financing of World War I. My specific ethnic interest is in Icelandic Canadians in World War I. The Icelanders are one of the few groups, along with the English, Scottish, and Irish, that were allowed to raise special battalions of nationalist battalions, and called the Viking Battalion. And I was surprised to learn that there was an exhibit in Reykjavik on the topic of Icelandic Canadians in World War I. So that piqued my curiosity. So on the way to England, I went via Iceland, and it was a magnificent display, which was intriguing because Iceland was, of course, neutral in World War I and indeed hostile to the whole idea of war. But it was a wonderful display, and with some others like the Eaton brothers, the late Fred and his brother John, we brought that display to the Manitoba Museum in Winnipeg. So I had for some time in World War I and II. But when the late Chris Colbrack came to the Rotman School as the chair of Canadian Business History, he was an extraordinary individual. And he said, we're going to have to write a book on comparing the development of the two countries in terms of finance. And so I said, well, that's great. And how are we going to, when we came to chunk out the various chapters, we would sit down and talk. And Chris came up with the title of The Great Disorder and Social Demands, 1914 to 1945. There, he wrote, the resulting changes in Canada and its financial system, although not as well known, were even more profound than in America. So what were those changes? And I guess the financial shock of the war was that even before it started, in late July 1914, all 5 Canadian stock exchanges closed, and they were closed for 3 months. That could have caused a panic, but the board and government moved quickly and passed the Finance Act, which is one of the most important pieces of legislation our country has had. It provided the government with the authority to issue new Dominion notes without gold backing in order to finance the war effort, and to lend to the charter banks at their request. However, there was no management of interest rates, and the gold standard, as you all know, was ended in Canada and most other countries for the duration of the war and beyond. I think in Canada's case till about the mid-20s. I want to talk about 3 long-term consequences of the financing of the war. 1 relates to taxes, 1 relates to debt, 1 relates to the transfer of the financial center from its historic home in Montreal to Toronto. In terms of taxes, wars are not fought with taxes. Wars are fought with debt and inflation. And that's a universal rule, I think, since the beginning of mankind. So when the war began, as you know, we had a protectionist economy as a result of the national policy of 1878. And immediately with the war, less goods were traveling. And so I think in the first year of the war, revenues were down by 30%. So gradually, there had to be other sources of revenue. And one of them was debt, and I'll come to that in a minute. But the other was taxes. And a temporary income tax was introduced towards the end of the war. It contributed very little in the way of financing of the war because it was little and late. But what it did do for our country was provide a framework where the Rao-Surwa Commission could make their report. And there was a WEC mechanism that led naturally into World War II, where our federal government finally had the fiscal tools it needed to fight a Second World War and to finance general government operations. In terms of debt financing, this was the most surprising to me of all. In 1913, 3/4 of our debt financing was financed in the United Kingdom. A short 5 years later, less than 0.5% of our debt financing came from the United Kingdom, and nearly 95% came from Canada, with the difference being raised in the United States. Indeed, initially, Canada had gone to the US market, but once the US finally got into the war, that avenue was closed. And so that's really a remarkable change in a very short period. And until I started doing this research, I had no idea at all about the difference. So there's another change, that Canada became self-sufficient. And once I'd done that, it made me realize things I'd seen since a child. There's a village in Saskatchewan called Saltcoats, near the Manitoba-Saskatchewan border, and I've been there often. There's a monument there by the lake to the war and those who died, and all the names are very familiar names from the British Isles, with the exception of my Uncle Yon, which I'd often noticed, but I'd never know. I had noticed beside that a German artillery piece. What I hadn't paid attention to before I started writing the book with Chris was the label on the artillery piece. And the artillery piece said, awarded to the village of Saltcoats for their outstanding success in selling war bonds. So this takes us to a very crucial change that the war contributed to, and that was the shift of the financial center from St. James Street to Bay Street. In my view of Canadian history, that change began in 1870-71 with our Bank Act, which is one of the great bank acts any country has ever had. And I think I say it began there because if the CEO of the Bank of Montreal had its way, it would have been a very different Bank Act. But that Bank Act gave opportunity to the banks of Ontario, or specifically the Bank of Commerce, and I guess we should recognize the role Senator McMaster played in that. That was the first step in my mind, of the shift to the financial center from Montreal to Toronto, even though it was not visible at the time. At that time, St. James Street was the Wall Street of Canada. But with bond financing, guess what happened? The great bond houses were in Toronto, Wood Gundy, Dominion Securities, AE Ames, and the reason they were here is a lot more bonds were sold in Ontario than were sold in Quebec for the simple reason that Ontario was much more supportive of the war than Quebec was. And so with that, the development of the bond houses in Toronto, that was the second stage in the shift of the economic center from Montreal to Toronto. And that was followed by the third combination of the stock market crash in 1929, which impacted Montreal much more than it did Toronto, and President Roosevelt increasing the price of gold by 2/3, which benefited immensely Toronto in terms of financing the gold miners, even though some of those mines were in Quebec, but they didn't have the rail access that the Ontario had to the mines. So what seemed very few people see, when I ask people about the shift from Montreal to Toronto, people talk to me about René Lévesque and the Parti Québécois, but the fact of the matter is the Time International edition in 1937 has a picture on its cover. I'm talking the international edition, not the Canadian edition, of the president of the Toronto Stock Exchange with their brand new building on Bay Street, the first building in Canada to have air conditioning, with the title, Canada's second city becomes the first. So that's my analysis of the big changes resulting from war financing. Since from writing from Wall Street to Bay Street, I have been reading books like, and here, if you want to make notes of some good books, Roger Lowenstein, War and Means, How Civil War Financial Agents Sold the World on the, War, Ways and Means, Lincoln and the Cabinet and the Financing of the Civil War. Shortly after that came out, I got this one here by David Thompson, Bonds of War, How Civil War Agents Sold the World on the Union. And then I went all the way back and got Hammond's classic Politics in America, how the revolution, from the revolution of the Civil War, and there he talks, that's a terrific book because it covers not only the United States, but also Canada. And he points out how a fundamental consequence in Canada of the War of 1812 was the establishment of the use of paper currency rather than specie. And that was a real change for Canada because the Québécois had a profound distrust of paper currency dating back a century or two from the days when the British Navy would blockade the St. Lawrence, and one governor decided the way to provide money was with playing cards, which quickly became inflationary. And so in the House in Lower Canada, 2 attempts to establish a bank before 1817, when the Bank of Montreal was founded, were blocked by French Canadians who did not trust paper currency. But with the War of 1812, it's very tough to fight a war, pay your suppliers, pay your soldiers, buy goods and services with specie. It's very heavy to carry around. So the British government brought in army bills for payment with the clearly stated purpose that they would expire within 2 years of the end of the war. So suddenly a demand had been created that couldn't be filled, and the Bank of Montreal was founded in 1817, although, as one scholar has pointed out, they didn't have a charter for 4 years, but that's not normally mentioned in histories of the Bank of Montreal. And then, of course, that brings us back to Alexander Hamilton's admonition on the importance of credit to winning a war I don't have a direct quote on that, but it's my recollection it goes something that he said to Washington. If we've got sound finance, we'll win the war. It's every bit as important, if not more important, than a good army. In conclusion, I look forward to reading more histories on financing of Canadian wars, not just one and two, but also Korea and even our current involvement with the Red Sea crisis. We must never forget Dostoevsky's immortal words, money is coined liberty. So thank you very much, David, for bringing this very serious topic to all of our attentions, and congratulations on your book. And Tabitha, if I could have a question first, I'd appreciate it.
Sure, you can go first.
Is that okay?
Yes.
David, I'd like to question about how you wrote the book, because as I read it, I thought, my heavens, what a geographic spread. And you've got, throughout the book, you have this picture of Canada, not what is called the Laurentian economy, but the whole country. And I sat there and said, now, how could he possibly have done this? He must have had a gigantic table with his sources laid out before him from across Canada, from west to east. Is that how you did it, or how did you manage that?
Well, I didn't use a table, but it goes back to a book, my previous book that you mentioned, Joe, about the Ford Motor Company in Windsor. And during its war years, it was very active in raising money for war bonds. Now, remember, this is the company that is selling Canadians on the Model T Fords. So I saw everything they did, all the bells and whistles. And I said, well, there was a national context here. So that was my guiding question. And I said, I would like to understand things on that national scale. So that led me to look for sources that I could use, mostly digital, that would let me set the scene for that. So one thing led to another, newspapers online, government accounts, online, all kinds of things. And eventually this national picture emerged. Then it broke down into the components, the parts that I was talking about. Is it exhaustive? No, there's so much to be done, and new sources, new books like yours, Joe, that have come up late to my attention. So that's how the book evolved, and I was doing this very much in a vacuum because I didn't know who else was working in this. And I said, is there any interest in war finance? So does that answer your question?
Oh, very much so. But I really like the way you did it. Might have liked a little more emphasis on Winnipeg, but other than that, I don't have any criticisms.
Okay, Winnipeg was a very hard city to canvass, as I discovered, for the people of the period. There were neighborhoods there which were very, very resistant. Okay, Winnipeg it is.
Thank you. So we'd like to open up the floor to anyone else on the call who has a question and would like to ask. You can either type your question directly into the chat, and I'll keep an eye on that, or you can raise your hand. If you have a little bar there at the bottom where it says reactions. If you click on that, there's an option to raise your hand. So if you have a question, please feel free to do either one of those actions and we will see it and ask it. In the meantime, I actually have a question. Joe, I was going to ask the same question. I wondered what the research methods were like, but another question for David is, what were some of the long-term consequences that Canada faced as a result of these very propaganda-ish financing efforts? What sort of were the long-term effects of that?
I'll answer that in two ways. There was the national debt, which the Minister of Finance during the war wasn't overly concerned about. Remember, his job was to get the money. His successor as finance minister, Henry Drayton, he began addressing, the debt and the deficit, and that carried on just as all the war bond issues were being refunded, and on they went. But another thing, the other part of this, your question is how did I discover sources? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, that was so similar sort of to Joe's question, like how, what I was really interested in your research methods and how you found your sources and gathered all of this information from.
Well, I knew the archival sources were thin. A lot of the material from the First World War on the victory loans eventually found their way into the hands of the National War Finance Committee during the Second World War. And from there, they went into the archives of the Bank of Canada, where a lot of sources, some of the sources, were subjected to privacy concerns, and I couldn't get at them. And there wasn't, unlike the United States, a big network of record keeping and deposits. So, I knew that, I had to rely upon not just published government accounts and financial records in the Department of Finance at the Canadian Archives, but I also said, well, I've got to go into some of the financial newspapers and the public newspapers, and do they exist for the time that I want to look at? There were lots of hits and misses there, and some road trips. So that was the methodology that I used, and that spread out the other parts of the book. So newspapers play a very large part, and I'm not an uncritical observer of newspaper reporting during the war. There we go.
Thank you. Eric Thompson, you raised your hand. Go ahead and ask the question.
So thank you, and I'll say I've just become aware of the book, so I'm very much looking forward to it, but haven't read it yet. So if I sound ignorant of what you've written, it's because I am. So I had a question thinking about Joe's observation that this sort of marks a pivoting away from England and the city's capital market, and wonder how much of it was based on imperial connections. I mean, Sir Thomas White had come into business through Flavel's firms. Flavel was working for the Imperial Munitions Board. The Imperial Munitions Board is also coordinating with Sir Robert Brand. How much of the sort of structure of the victory loan is borrowed from UK sort of organizational and technical means, and how much of it is sort of domestic improvisation?
You want me to start, or do you want David?
You go first, Joe.
A good question, Eric. The first thing is the imperial government slammed the door. The reason we had to get money elsewhere is because they blocked debt financing into Canada. So it was, in a sense, not because of a connection. Yeah. And then I think what I learned, I had the aggregate figures, but what I learned from reading David's book is it was a remarkably grassroots effort. And I mean, I sort of facetiously talked about Winnipeg, but there the key figure was Sir Augustus Nanton, and if you take the title of David's colorful title of Boosters and Barkers, there was a lot of boosting and barking, and it reached to the grassroots. I mean, that's what I got out of David's book. So, David, you take it from there.
Okay, Joe. Further to that answer, Canada would have known that the United Kingdom had its own national war loan late in 1914. Canada's first one was in November of 1915. But even before that, the necessity, for the war finance set in place in early 1915 when we had this reciprocal arrangement with the Imperial Munitions Board. We'll pay for the munitions and food. You look after our troops. And that escalated through 3 successive Dominion war loans into a more popular type of war loan, very grassroots, very not totally improvised, because they were taking lessons from the Canadian Patriotic Fund, from the Canadian Red Cross and their campaigns to, how to get money on smaller scales, yes, but, how to appeal to people who would not normally, have looked at investments or large dollars. So somebody subscribing for a $50 war bond, well, today that would be worth substantially more in cost. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, a little bit, and I'm thinking just of Nanton, I suppose, and I guess I'll be talking about him at Banff, but through the HBC, Nanton's on the board of directors with Kindersley, who's head of the savings program, the national savings program in the UK. And so I wonder about these imperial connections helping even Canada develop its sort of autonomous savings plan, the Victory Loan. So
I trace the imperial help in the book, so take it from there.
Okay, thank you.
Eric, it's a really good question, and let me just add one other thing. I really wasn't supposed to be on with David. I thought originally it would be great to get somebody from one of the bond houses, or even a business reporter. And I spoke to more than one, let me tell you. And while they know their field, they don't know history.
Huh.
And and if you want a little test, go online and look at mind you, I was talking to somebody yesterday that they're taking it up, but the Montreal Stock Exchange, you have no idea, looking at that the largest exchange in Canada, which it was, and by a wide margin, was closed because of in July of 1914. So, I mean, David's identified a real gap. And in your point, I'm intrigued with your question, because my first job was with the old Monarch Life, and J. Elmer Woods was chairman of the Canadian Committee of the Bay. And in Winnipeg, the Canadian Committee of the Bay was sort of like being knighted in England. And but we don't, it's an area that needs exploring.
Please feel free to raise your hand or type it in the chat if you have any more questions. I have another question, actually. So you spoke a lot, David, about the propaganda that was used to influence Canadians to purchase war bonds. And it kind of makes me think about now the current climate in which many Canadians are upset with sort of the idea that government is influencing them in some way, like using propaganda or something else. So it makes me wonder, was there any lasting impact of the propaganda techniques that were used on Canadians? Like, did they come to trust the government less? Was there any sort of external impact from that you noticed in your research?
After the war, propaganda got a bad name. And it became very derogatory. People were not as susceptible to it. Yes, there was propaganda for the demobilization in late 1918 and 19 of the Canadian forces, but people weren't buying into it as much for that reason. They weren't exposed to it as much. And remember what I said about atmosphere. That died down so that it became very investment focused. And people had mixed emotions about propaganda, which before the war was not as bad a thing, because propaganda then meant very neutral sharing of information about government services and so on. The term comes up in that way. So, for people now looking at, we use the words disinformation and so on, are we as able to filter that now as people became used to at that time? I'm not sure about that, but that's a topic for another talk. Okay.
And what do you hope that some of the lasting impacts of your book will be? Like, what do you hope people can really take away and maybe change in the world or change in society as a result of the book that you've written?
Well, they can be more open to some of the areas that I looked at. If you oppose an idea, if you don't think it's right, stand up and talk about it. if you are exposed to all kinds of media propaganda? How do you deal with that? How do you deal with income tax, which has become part of our lives, and things like that? So I'm not going out here for big impact. I'm hoping to stimulate the sort of conversations we've had today about the wartime. And lastly, further to what our two participants were just saying, I too had trouble finding people to talk about wartime, finance. That told me two things. Nobody's interested in it. Nobody wants to hear anything about it, from me. And that was a big obstacle. But I said, well, keep going. It's a retirement project, and we'll follow it through to the end. And now we know what the end is.
Go ahead, Joe.
Well, one thing that, and I really just thought of it today, I went to the War Museum site, and I really think we have a wonderful War Museum, right from the way it's set so low, so to give you the sense of the battlefield in World War I. I'm a great admirer of Tim Cook. But I guess the next time I see Tim, I'm going to ask him, do you have anything, even a small display, on the financing of World War I? Because now it's been a few years since I've been there, but I certainly don't recall a section on the financing of World War I. And that leads me to ask a question of David. I got a little bit confused in my reading as whether you were an admirer or not of Sir Thomas White.
I admired what he accomplished. I can't help but thinking we have a recent finance minister, without naming names, who came in from the business world and after a few years had a quick exit. But what I admired about White was not his liberal conservative ideologies, but the fact that he was facing an enormous task, and he was very hypersensitive. He told Robert Borden more than once, "I want to quit. I'm out of here," and Borden kept cajoling with him, and talking to him. So I'm not a huge fan. He wanted, as I said in my talk, to control the levers of finance, and he was very, very, concerned that he didn't lose that. And there were times when it did get out of control a little bit, but he stuck with it, and he had the bankers and the bond dealers association with him on this, and you've named some names there. So I'm not totally for or against Thomas White. I admired this. And he was in government for only, a few years before he resigned the cabinet or the portfolio, and then left the, Commons in 1921. Went back to, make a living in private practice. He said that his time looking as finance minister just about bankrupted him. So I was curious about that. Well, what was he doing with all his salary? I don't know. More stories to unfold. Yes.
We've got one final question here. Richard Silla, why don't you unmute yourself and go ahead and ask it?
Okay, I will do that. I'll even show myself. Got to say hello to my buddy Joe Martin. In a book I co-authored with Sidney Homer called The History of Interest Rates, we have a brief chapter on Canada, and I'm going to read a couple sentences from it. It says, Canada's war effort was large. She supplied some 640,000 troops for World War I, which cost her $1.5 billion. The Victory loan campaigns at 5 and 5.5% led to the development of a domestic bond market. In the drive of October 1918, more than 1 million people subscribed 700 million. Now, I looked up while we were having our call here today what the population of Canada was, and around that time it was about 8 million people. And if you say the average family was a family of 4, there might have been 2 million families. And it just seems to me remarkable if 1 million people subscribe to this maybe half the families in Canada subscribe. And it's, how do they accomplish that? I mean, I know a little bit about the bond drives in the United States, and you mentioned a little bit about it and showed us that picture, but what sort of marketing techniques did they use to get half the families in Canada, roughly speaking, to invest in these victory bonds?
I'll start by answering, that. I think, in my estimation, the most effective form of propaganda were not the parades or the bells and whistles, but the millions of informational pamphlets that were distributed to everybody, anybody who would take them, along the parade routes, door to door. So people began thinking, well, this is a good thing, even if they bought one bond, whether for patriotic purposes or not. And in the chapter on resistance, I show some cases where people bought bonds but didn't want to go and fight. So there was a big investment incentive, which came along in a wave. And the interest rate was reasonable, and people could pay by payroll deductions. That didn't always work, but there were different means for people to subscribe, and not everybody who subscribed followed through on that. So I get into that in the book. So some figures may be a little bit distorted. Does that help to answer your question?
Yeah, but I think it is remarkable the extent of participation in that victory loan drive.
We go back to that letter I read from that boy out west, and he said, I've been selling, getting prize money, and there's other stories about a girl who ran a trap line and saved up money. Kids were very susceptible to this message, of doing their bit.
In the U.S., we had in World War I, we had movie stars like Charlie Chaplin and Douglas Fairbanks and all that, helping to market the bonds, and that was probably a little less true in Canada, unless there was a great thriving Canadian movie industry then. But
there was the woman whose statue's on in front of sick kids.
Mary Pickford.
Mary Pickford, yeah.
Mary Pickford.
And the other thing, Dick, that I would say is that, and I go back to my work on a specific ethnic, and albeit a very tiny one, the Icelanders. I just can't imagine what those young Icelandic Canadians said when they went to tell their mother that they volunteered for war. I mean, their mothers would have been angry. But let's take Winnipeg, which is the major city where they were. They were not allowed to play hockey against the other teams because they were ethnic. Now, it's pretty tough, I think, for most people to tell an Icelander from an Englishman by physical appearance. And, and then in 1919, when hockey there was a gold medal, they were allowed to play, and they beat the best in the West, and then came to Toronto and beat the University of Toronto. And after that, they were accepted. So it was also among the ethnic community, I think there was a striving for acceptance. And so there were, I suspect, pretty good sales in the ethnic community.
David Wilson's got a question. David, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Yes, David, I was very interested in your introductory remarks, and it struck me that your book is, in many respects, as much about social history as it is about financial history. And with that in mind, could you talk a little more about social pressures to buy bonds, and indeed social resistance to buying bonds? How much of that did you encounter?
An awful lot. I'll take as a springboard Winnipeg, which Joe talked about. There were sectors in the north area of the city which were largely immigrant, and were very resistant, to war bonds. And of course, the organizers in Winnipeg said, let the women do it. Give them the low return areas. And this is not an uncommon strategy. Send them out and see what they can do, and we'll look at that. But there, despite one participant said, about the overwhelming public response, there were social mumblings, and in terms of social history, remember that a lot of people, all they could do would be to give a nickel, a dime, 25 cents, to a sock campaign or a Belgian relief fund, and had no way of saving up, $50 or more. The most popular bonds were for higher denominations, and that gets into what did the corporate world contribute, to these war bonds? Well, up to 35%. So that puts a different perspective on it. But yes, social history, I think, pervades, my approach and my understanding. And some people will say, well, it's not purely social history. It's not military history. It's not about big battles, and war heroes and generals and leaders. But it is about, government finance and how that went out into the society. So that's my approach. So that pervades every chapter.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
And that takes us to the end of our time today. So I would like to say thank you so much for everyone who's on our call, but also to David Roberts for participating in this. We're very grateful when we are able to get more perspectives. It's always a good thing. So thank you very much to everyone on the call today. Have a happy holiday, and
Thank you.
we'll
Thank
see you
you.
soon. Thanks.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
David.
Bye.